Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction and also for the invitation to be with you today to discuss matters to do with excellence in higher education. As has been said, my background in this is as chair of the working group for ENQA, looking at the concept of excellence in higher education. And I've had the privilege and opportunity to talk with members of the PHExcel project team previously. I did a presentation to a meeting of the project group this time last year, last September in Brussels. So do forgive me, those of you who were present then, if I'm going back over some of the ground that I covered in that presentation. But I think it is timely to take stock about where we have got to in terms of the debate around excellence in higher education. And certainly the ENQA working group has recently received support from the ENQA board for a continuation of the project to look more specifically at the practicalities of excellence, how we can embody the concept of excellence in the practice of quality assurance. And that will be the next stage of our journey, so to speak, in terms of how we may use the ideas of excellence in taking forward a changing agenda for quality assurance, particularly relevant, I think, perhaps in the United Kingdom at the moment. As I gather you discussed yesterday, we are at a time in the UK where we are reflecting on and considering future directions for quality assurance, and excellence, I think, is one of the concepts which will help to frame that debate and discussion. The other general point I wanted to make by way of introduction was just to reflect on where we've come from and where we are now in this debate around excellence, because when we started with the working group back in 2012, the title of our group was looking at the concept of excellence, the idea of excellence in higher education, and whether or not it was a concept that could be of some value in terms of interpreting, defining, representing the characteristics of higher education. And over that 3-year period, I think we've now moved to a situation where excellence is entering the language of policy. You discussed yesterday the Teaching Excellence Framework, which government has recently published in the UK. And so I think it's no longer just an idea. I think it is something which is being taken up. Whether it is being well defined and well used in the context of policy development is an issue for debate and discussion, I think. But things have moved on, and people now are talking about excellence as an important concept in terms of the structures of the practices of quality assurance. The subtitle of my presentation is The View from Quality Agencies, and I'm going to talk very much from the perspective of somebody who's worked in quality assurance for many years. And indeed, the working group is a group of people with a background and experience in quality assurance. But I think there is a lot to be gained from using the concept of excellence in terms of taking forward the debate around quality assurance and quality enhancement. And those are themes that I would like to touch on this morning. The outline for the presentation, I'll say a little bit about the working group, where we are, where we've been, where we're going with the work of the group. I want to talk about excellence and quality assurance and talk about going beyond threshold academic standards. The whole approach to quality assurance, not only in the UK but more generally through ENQA and the European higher education area, has been one of assuring the threshold standards, the minimum standards of requirements for higher education. And I think increasingly now people are questioning whether threshold standards are sufficient to define the characteristics of institutions. And I know that's what many of you will be concerned with in terms of identifying excellence in specific subject areas and your own areas of responsibility. There's been much talk about definitions of excellence. I'm not going to offer yet another definition of excellence, but I will raise the idea and the point about definition and why I think it is significant. Then to say a little bit about excellence in practice and examples that we have at the moment of the use of the term excellence and what it means in different contexts with some current examples. Then finally to conclude by talking about the view that the group took about how we might take forward the agenda around excellence, particularly using a criterion reference model for excellence, and how that might relate to alternative models for quality assurance in the future. A lot to cover. I hope I can get through in good time, and I'm very happy to pick up any of these points in more detail in the discussion session afterwards. The ENQA working group, set up, as I say, in 2012, one of a number of working groups set up by ENQA to explore aspects of quality assurance across the European higher education area. Many of them were quite practical, looking at things like staff development and the practice of quality assurance, but the excellence working group was one which was more conceptual. It was, as I say, it was intended to be a discussion group to explore the key concepts and practices around excellence. It was a group made up of representatives from a range of European quality agencies and some very helpful and useful contributions from different perspectives of quality agencies working with institutions with different backgrounds and different national contexts for developing and delivering quality assurance activity. We have completed that first stage of the project. We have produced our report, which is available on the ENQA website if you'd like to look at it. And we have reported our findings to the ENQA Chief Executive Officers last year at the meeting in Zagreb last October. And we are taking it further forward with a higher level policy seminar with the European Commission in Brussels at the end of this month. So we've got some outcomes, we've got something to report on in terms of the work of the group, although it was largely a deliberative group, and it was a challenge, I should say, to try and bring together the varied perspectives and contributions from members of the group into a single document which gave a view on the concept of excellence and how it might be used in the context of quality assurance. Next steps. We haven't finished, we are moving on. We have, as I say, got further funding to look at the more practical aspects of this with the newly published revised European standards and guidelines. I think there are some interesting issues that we can fruitfully work on in trying to look at how the expectations of the European standards and guidelines can be addressed through some of the discussions and ideas that surrounded the whole debate around excellence in higher education. So that's where we're up to. Let me move on to talk about excellence and quality assurance and the role of quality assurance more generally in supporting development in the higher education sector as a whole. As I say, I think the general model, the general thinking about quality assurance across Europe has been based on the assumptions that the role of quality assurance agencies is to provide assurance for stakeholders about the maintenance of threshold academic standards across higher education as a whole. In the Quality Assurance Agency in the UK, our mission starts with higher education qualifications. We see our mission as providing public assurance of the credibility and security of higher education qualifications. And we apply that approach across the range now of higher education institutions that we review. It was mentioned in the introduction that QAA started out being an agency reviewing universities. The original organisation, the Academic Audit Unit that was set up in 1990, was set up by the older established universities to provide public assurance around quality and standards. Over time, we have extended our reach to cover all types of higher education provider. First, the post-92s as part of the reforms in the UK in the 1990s. Then the further education colleges, which offer elements of higher education, that higher education came within the remit of QAA. And more recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've taken on responsibility for quality assuring private institutions. Private institutions wishing to recruit international students and needing highly trusted sponsor status from the Home Office to issue visas for international students, and private organisations that wish to have access to public funding through the student loans company. Those two criteria now are met by meeting the review expectations of QAA. So we are covering the whole of higher education, but it means, in effect, what we have done is extend a methodology for quality assurance defined and delivered originally around established higher education institutions to apply across a much more varied and differentiated higher education sector, and that brings with it a number of significant changes. I've put here life cycle of quality assurance activities. I think there is a growing view, certainly in this country, that we need to think beyond the current constraints of our existing methodology. That we have been in QAA reviewing some institutions in this country for over 25 years. Many of the established universities have been through at least 5 cycles of institutional level quality assurance review, some more than that. And there is a perception that the practice of quality assurance is meeting with what we sometimes refer to as diminishing returns, that it's not having the impact that it had in the early stages when we first conducted our audits of institutions. In the early stages, there was a lot of development. Institutions responded to external review by putting in place quality systems, by ensuring that their quality systems worked effectively, by developing new approaches to quality assurance and quality enhancement. But now, 25 years on, they're well practiced in the systems and procedures of quality assurance. Institutions have quality teams. They have well-designed and well-developed quality procedures. And to go on reviewing institutions using the same basic methodology raises questions about the value of the exercise in terms of institutional development. So there is, I think, a real issue about how do we take the agenda beyond looking simply at threshold academic standards. If we have, through our practices, provided that assurance that the greater majority of institutions in the UK, certainly of universities and higher education, established higher education providers, are fulfilling those expectations, we need to think of ways in which we can develop and take forward the agenda for quality assurance and quality development. And part of that is about going beyond threshold academic standards and possibly looking for ways in which institutions can demonstrate aspects of excellence in the way in which they conduct their business. It raises a whole series of interesting questions, I think, about once you accept the value of moving beyond threshold standards, about what it is you're trying to achieve. Are we going to be looking at identifying the variability of higher education institutions? There are those who argue that the sector should be more clearly differentiated. Our approach of one size fits all is not helpful because it doesn't identify the best institutions and it doesn't contribute to, for example, to the creation of league tables or the development of reputation of institutions across the sector. Is that what we should be using quality assurance for in order to define differentiation? And should we be looking to develop a methodology that will reflect these inherent characteristics of different types of institutions? These are all issues that we are looking at currently in our discussions about a future approach to quality assurance. I said I would talk about definitions of excellence, and I'm fascinated to hear the contribution this morning about understanding excellence and how excellence can be articulated in the context of higher education provision. There is, I think, a lot of widespread use of the term without a clear understanding of what is meant by the term. It's something that has entered into the language. Excellence in higher education is something which most universities in the UK would claim and do claim in their publicity material, in their prospectuses. They claim to be excellent without necessarily having evidence to back it up in terms of measurable and quantifiable metrics. But excellence is something that everybody wishes to achieve. It's what institutions would like to achieve in terms of their reputation and public perception. But as I say, the concept of excellence is much more slippery than that, much more difficult than that to deal with. Generally, I think we started in our discussions and debates in the working group with the idea that excellence was about something that was exceptional, meritocratic, outstanding practice. We had some really good discussions, I think, about what we considered to be excellent institutions, and particularly, interestingly, in the conversations I've had with Jeremy Cox, about the conservatoires conservatoires as examples of excellence because of the ethos of the institutions, that they work to exceptionally high standards, world-class standards in terms of the achievements and performance of students. And is that a model of excellence that can be used in order to articulate the concept more generally across the sector? Is excellence an absolute relative concept? Can we only have excellence by measuring performance against other institutions? Does it have to be comparative in order to have excellence? If all institutions are excellent, then no institutions are excellent because everybody's achieved the same standard, and that's the dilemma about what you mean by excellence and how it can be articulated. And should we look at excellence not as something that has been achieved, but as an aspiration for institutions? I think, as I say, most institutions would claim that they were aspiring for excellence. That's what they want to achieve. And perhaps it's that aspiration, in the context which was mentioned earlier about quality enhancement, that's perhaps what we should be focusing on. It's not what is happening at the moment in an institution, but what its mission is, what it's aspiring to achieve in the future and aspiring for its students. So there are many ways in which you can look at excellence and many ways in which the concept can be applied. But I think it has value, and there is a need to define the concept in the context in which it's being used by different institutions. That takes me on to current practice, excellence in practice, and leading on from the discussions you had yesterday around the teaching excellence framework. We have both a research excellence framework and now proposals for a teaching excellence framework in the UK. The research excellence framework used to be the research assessment exercise, but was renamed an excellence framework with a changed set of parameters for assessing the value of research across the higher education sector, particularly the concept of impact of research and the usefulness of research in terms of its impact on society and economy more generally. The teaching excellence framework, I think, is less well articulated at the moment, and the green paper that's just recently been published raises some interesting ideas and suggestions about what excellence might be seen as in the future. I think this is a classic example, of governments dealing with difficult issues by putting them in the title of the paper. It's called an excellence framework, but not necessarily addressing what they mean by excellence, because that's what everyone wants to address in terms of expectations around the quality of teaching in higher education. Just as the previous white paper was called Students at the Heart of the System, because it was a political statement about commitment to student interest in higher education, but the white paper actually didn't say a great deal about how student interests could actually be articulated. So it's a neat technique to use the term in order to raise expectations or give the indication that government is addressing critical and important issues. But the Teaching Excellence Framework, I think, is one of those policies which is being developed retrospectively. It was announced originally by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the House of Commons that from 2017-18 onwards, institutions which were able to demonstrate excellence in teaching would be allowed to raise fees in line with inflation. So it was a conditional, it was a deal, so to speak, between government and the universities about future funding for higher education. Having made that commitment, which will be implemented in 2017, there is then the need to articulate what was meant by teaching excellence. This is not a new thing. The quality of teaching has been an issue for as long as I've been involved in higher education, and we've a whole history of initiatives of one kind or another which have tried to either promote quality in teaching, like the Centres of Excellence in Learning and Teaching, the CETLs, that were funded by the Funding Council in England 8 or 9 years ago, or have, in the days of the 1990s, explored ways of linking funding for universities to their performance in relation to teaching quality. We had a whole series of subject reviews in the 1990s, many will remember. And prior to subject review, we had something called teaching quality assessment, which encouraged institutions to identify excellence in terms of their teaching quality, and which it was intended in the fullness of time would lead to a more differentiated funding model to balance out the funding for research. This is the long-standing issue about the parity of esteem between teaching and research, and the perception, belief that universities focus more on research in some circumstances than on pedagogy. And government attempting to redress that balance through higher education policy. The Green Paper has some interesting things in it. I think there is to be an interesting discussion now about how teaching excellence will be measured, the criteria. I've listed here the three main areas that have been identified in the Green Paper, looking at student satisfaction through the National Student Survey, looking at the results that students achieve from their higher education studies, the outputs from higher education, and looking specifically at graduate employment and the argument that employment, and particularly the level of graduate salaries, could be used as a surrogate measure to represent the quality of teaching experience that students have had in institutions. I think we all have some reservations about all three of these areas of measurement for teaching excellence, and there will no doubt be some very helpful responses in terms of the comments that people will make in relation to the Green Paper. But I think it illustrates very clearly this difficulty of trying to work with a concept, an idea, and then to force it into a framework of measurement to allow differentiation. The whole idea of having the framework was to allow some institutions to receive additional funding through higher fees, but not others, so to create that differentiation on the basis of quality of teaching. It's not quite how it's working out in practice. The Green Paper refers to grades of excellence, that most institutions in the first instance will be graded as TEF 1, the first level of teaching excellence. And to be graded as TEF 1, it will be simply necessary for institutions to demonstrate that they have had a successful quality assurance review within the last 6 years or so, which in effect means the greater majority of established higher education institutions will meet the basic criteria for excellence. And going back to what I was saying earlier about if everyone's excellent, is that really a measure of excellence? But then we are promised in later years TEF 2, TEF 3 and even TEF 4, which implies levels of excellence, and that is something which we hadn't really given any consideration to in terms of our debate and discussion. We thought excellence was indivisible in a sense. You don't have good excellence and less good excellence. Excellence is excellence. And how those higher grades of excellence will be achieved, it is hoped and expected that they will be based around concepts of learning gain in institutions and more precise measures of what students actually do in terms of comparing academic results between different types of institutions. And one of the fundamental problems in this area is that there is no national system for assessment in higher education. Unlike the grading of schools on the basis of A-level results, where the examinations are national examinations and there is the possibility to compare performance between schools, all universities and many other higher education providers are self-accrediting. They set their own exams, they mark their own papers, they decide on the performance of students independently and individually. So there are no yardsticks that you can easily use in order to measure relative performance of institutions, and hence the need for different types of metrics. You've talked about teaching excellence. I won't go on at greater length, but I think in the future there's a big debate to be had around this issue. It is, in a sense, a fait accompli. We are landed with teaching excellence because of the commitments that have already been given, that it will be introduced. And I think it's a real challenge now about how we articulate these expectations across the sector in terms of defining and articulating the meaning of excellence in the higher education context. Interesting that it's teaching excellence and not learning excellence. It's another dimension to this, that teaching is only one part of the student learning experience in higher education. But enough of the UK. It's not just a it's not just a local issue, I don't think. We have our own particular issues to deal with here in the United Kingdom, but there are other approaches to excellence in other parts of Europe, and areas that we touched on in the working paper included the Excellence Initiative in Germany, which is an attempt through federal government to raise the profile of individual institutions by funding research and attempting to develop more world-class research of individual types of institution. Looking at the models, particularly in the States, with the preeminence of the elite universities, the Ivy League universities, and how they define excellence in the concept of a wider higher education sector, and whether or not that can be replicated through the route of investing in research to raise the profile of institutions. Centres of Excellence in Finland, some of you may be familiar with, is a process based on institutional submission. Institutions submit claims for excellence, which are then evaluated by peer experts as to whether or not those claims can be substantiated. And if they are, then it not only gives an additional recognition to the excellence of an individual institution, but it also has some funding implications as well. And similarly, there is a contribution in the paper on the best study programs in Russia, where the scale of activity is on a completely different level to most other European countries, and where the agencies in Russia are attempting to find ways of drawing comparisons between the performance of a large number of institutions in terms of the programs that they offer. And it's an interesting process through the use of accreditation to try and identify and encourage improvement and enhancement in higher education. So there is a lot going on, and I think this concept of excellence is being quite widely used and quite widely adopted, but it's being used in different ways in different contexts in different countries, and there is, I think, much to be gained from a comparative analysis of how individual countries and how agencies are working around this concept in order to incorporate it into their activities. I mentioned at the beginning that the group did eventually come to a consensus around what we believed excellence to be. And this is just a quotation that's taken from one of the contributions in the report. I should stress the report is a joint venture. Members of the group each contributed sections to the report, so it was intended to try and reflect the range of views and perceptions around excellence. And the member of the group who came from the agency in Portugal wrote, I thought, a very good paper about understanding excellence and how excellence can be used as a concept, drawing on the work of Strike, written now back in the 1980s, but making a distinction between a norm reference and a criterion reference model for excellence. Norm reference, I think, is probably the more familiar use of the term excellence, where excellence is seen as being relative to performance of other institutions. Some institutions do better than others, and it's only if you can have an elite group of institutions that the concept of excellence has public understanding and public meaning. Whereas Strike was arguing that a criterion reference model for excellence was a more appropriate way to improve quality, to enhance quality across the range of higher education provision as a whole. With a criterion model, you define standards and then establish the extent to which institutions meet those standards in terms of their performance. Many parallels here, I think, with some of the work that's been done in the States with the Baldrige model and other excellence models used in the States. But in theory, at least, everyone can aspire to excellence, and all institutions can look for ways in which elements of excellence can be incorporated into their strategic planning and their development internally. We came up with a number of criteria that we thought might be relevant in this context around three main areas. Looking at achievement, looking at student achievement particularly, excellent institutions achieving excellent results in terms of the capabilities and achievements of students. But also achievements in other areas of universities' activity in research, knowledge transfer, contributions to society and so on. We looked at stakeholder satisfaction, whether students were positive about their experience of education, whether employers and other stakeholders were impressed with the quality of the students that came from the institution, the general feedback on performance of institutions, and whether that could be an area that would be used in order to reinforce the public perception about what was happening in a higher education institution. And thirdly, touching on some of the points that were mentioned this morning, the social, economic and cultural role of universities. That they are not simply higher training institutions. They're not simply to do with teaching or with research. That they have a much more ill-defined role in terms of social and cultural development, and that is something that needs to be taken into consideration in terms of the general view of an institution. And I've included on this slide the all-important question about who assesses excellence. Excellence means different things in different contexts to different people. And is this something that is done by self-ascription? Is it done by expert evaluation, by peers, in the way in which, for example, some of the league tables are drawn up by getting peer evaluation? Or is it something that should be based on the views of others, on stakeholder views, in terms of whether or not an institution is doing the job that is expected of it, and so on? So I don't think there's a simple answer to that, but I think it's a critical starting point for excellence about how you look at people's perceptions of what excellence actually is. And finally, what does this all mean for quality? And that's really where I started at the beginning of this presentation. That the value of the debate around excellence, I think, is the opportunity to look ahead at how we might take forward the concept of quality assurance as well as the concept of excellence itself. I mentioned the life cycle model or theory, if you like, of quality assurance, that after 25 years you need to reassess. It's like an S-shaped curve, and I think we've been through the steep part of the S-shaped curve. Many institutions have responded to the expectations around quality assurance, and we're now on that plateau at the top where you need to rethink and reassess the approach. What should we be focusing on in the future with regard to quality assurance? I've started with the quite widespread view that quality assurance should move more towards quality enhancement. Not a new idea by any means. Our review method in Scotland has for many years been called enhancement-led institutional review. And the approach to quality assurance in Scottish higher education has always been, since the last 15 years or so, been focused on using quality assurance as a mechanism, as a method for driving quality enhancement across the higher education sector. And I think there's a lot more that we could do in relation to that. I believe quality assurance is an enhancement mechanism. I think the actual practice of quality assurance, and particularly the preparation that institutions go through before QAA comes knocking on the door, is valuable in terms of investing in quality development within institutions. But it could be more explicit, and it could be more upfront in the way in which we conduct our activities. So a move towards enhancement is, I think, part of the debate and discussion. The development of more risk-based methodologies. This is very much a popular area at the moment. The suggestion that our methodology should be proportionate. We should focus our attention on those institutions which demonstrate higher levels of risk to academic standards or the quality of learning experience than those that are now well established and have a strong track record in quality assurance. We have made some moves in that direction in the current methodology that we're using, but there is a lot more that could be done in terms of differentiating the approach to quality assurance. It raises some big issues. The assumption that we've started with, that all institutions should meet threshold standards, that one size fits all, does give a degree of comparability and assurance to students across the whole of the higher education sector. Once you move down the proportionate route, then we are starting to introduce differentiation into quality assurance. We're saying some institutions need more attention than others. If you use the language of a risk-based methodology, then by implication we would be saying that some institutions were high risk or not as low risk as others, and to categorize an institution as being at risk would have quite serious implications for its ability to recruit students and so on. So the reputational aspects of this are serious to consider, but risk-based methodologies are certainly part of the agenda at the moment. Comparative analysis. There's a move, I think, amongst many institutions to benchmark against institutions in other countries. The growth of joint programs, the increasing globalization of higher education means that universities in the UK are not content simply to benchmark against other universities in the UK. They wish to establish their credentials against other world ranking institutions in other parts of the world. And comparative benchmarking, I think, will become very much a part of how institutions will wish to address issues to do with quality in the future. That leads into league tables and world rankings. Many institutions have aspirations and ambitions to become world ranking, to be in the top 400 or so, whatever, of the world league tables. But that brings with it its own challenges about how do you demonstrate. It's possible to claim it, but how do you demonstrate world-class status for an institution? Is it based on reputation, or is it based on research performance, or whatever? Those are interesting questions to consider. Okay, just two more points. One on validating claims for excellence by peer review, which I think is an important consideration. Are we going to rely on the expertise of others, peers, to define and recognise excellence, which introduces a degree of subjectivity in the process? And finally, the vexed question about linking funding to quality. Is this viable? I can see that it may be an area that government wishes to explore, but the complexity of trying to link funding to quality is one which I think is likely to raise a whole host of issues for the future. Thank you very much.